Her keynote is titled Embodied Vulnerabilities. Why am I hacking my own heart? Please welcome Dr. Marie Moet to the S4 Europe stage.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here in Vienna to present this room full of ICS security people about why I'm hacking my heart. So I'm here as a security researcher, but also as a patient. Every single beat of my heart is generated by a medical device, a pacemaker implanted in my body. 5 years ago, I woke up lying on the floor. It turned out I had fallen because my heart had taken a pause, long enough to cause unconsciousness. So to keep my pulse up and prevent my heart from taking breaks, I needed to have the pacemaker. This little device monitors each single heartbeat and sends a small electrical signal directly to my heart via an electrode to keep it beating. But how can I trust my heart when it's running on proprietary code and there's no transparency? When I got the pacemaker, it was an emergency procedure. I needed the device to stay alive, so there really was no option to not have the implant. It was, however, time to ask questions. Questions. To the surprise of my doctors, I began asking questions about data security, about the possibilities of hacking this, for me, life-critical device. The answers were unsatisfying. My healthcare providers couldn't answer technical questions about computer security, and many of my doctors haven't even thought about the fact that this machine inside my body is running code. This is why I decided to seek out this information myself. Imagine that this is your heartbeat, and it's being controlled by a machine inside of your body, being controlled by software and hardware inside of your body. Wouldn't you also like to know if it can be trusted? So they warned me to not have any ICS Security 101 in my presentation, but I thought I would include a Biology 101 to start off. I see some people are nodding. So my background is in mathematics, computer security, and incident response. So I was actually working at the NorCERT, the Norwegian Computer Emergency Response Team, doing incident response for the government and for companies within critical infrastructure in Norway, when I suddenly got this heart problem. And of course, after that, I read up a little bit on how the heart works. So the heart is a wonderful biological process control system, in a way. The pulse is generated by the sinus node. So the sinus node creates a small electrical signal, and then that signal makes the upper part of the heart, the atrium, contract. And then this signal travels down to the ventricles. And on its way, it passes something called the AV node, the atrioventricular node. And this node gives a small delay to the signal, so that you get the optimal pumping effect, so that you get the contraction first in the upper heart chamber, and then in the lower heart chamber. So, kadunk, kadunk. In my case, I suddenly had a failure of the electrical system in my heart. So the signal stopped in the AV node. It didn't reach the ventricles. It means that the lower heart chambers were on their own in creating a pulse for me. Luckily, the heart has an inbuilt backup system in case this goes wrong. So there are some cells also in the ventricles that can take over the pacemaker functionality and create this small electrical signal in case it doesn't come through as it's supposed to. But the problem is that these cells are not creating a signal that is well regulated to the body's need. So it will create a very irregular or low pulse. So in my case, my pulse was below 40 beats per minute, between 30 and 40, and it was really irregular. So I was admitted to the hospital, and they put me on close monitoring to see what was going on. When I had this problem when I just fell to the floor. And they could see that my heart took breaks up to 7 seconds. And you really can't stay conscious if you don't get enough oxygen to the brain. So a pause around 10 seconds will make you lose consciousness, typically. So the way the pacemaker corrects this is, for me, I have 2 wires going from the machine, the hardware part of the pacemaker is directly under my skin, and then I have 2 wires that are going through the veins, and they are screwed into the heart, one in the upper chamber and one in the lower chamber. The upper wire is mostly listening and monitoring my heart to see that my sinus node is working as it should. And then the other wire is waiting to see if the signal comes through via the AV node, which in my case is, it never comes through. So 100% of the time, the other wire is creating this signal that makes my heart contract. So this is the electrical system of the heart. It's wonderful, right? So my heart and my life is depending on this hardware and software. Here you can see a printout from my latest checkup at the hospital, where the upper line is indicating that I'm 100% dependent on the pacemaker, because this is how, during a course of 24 hours, the percentage of time that my ventricle is being paced. The lower graph shows how often my atrium is being paced. This is the upper wire that usually just monitors to see if the sinus node creates the pulse it's supposed to. And there's actually a configuration in the pacemaker that makes it's impossible for my heart to go below 50 beats per minute, because that's the number put into the configuration file of the device. And since I'm a quite young person, sometimes during the night when I sleep, my pulse drops below 50 beats per minute naturally. And this is when the upper heart chamber is also paced. So you can see the lower graph. It's during nighttime when my pulse dropped below 50 beats per minute, and also the upper wire kicked in and gave me a pulse. So it's sort of taken control over my natural rhythm from the sinus node. The other picture you can see here is the inside of a pacemaker that we dissected in the lab at Sintef, where I work. So I got hold of some equipment when I started my hacking project. And one of the things we did was to look into the hardware of the devices to see if we could identify some of the chips. And it's quite fascinating. This is the same model or brand of device that I have. So these chips are most likely inside of my body. So I started this project as a kind of hobby project because I was 1.5 years ago invited to give a keynote talk at a hacker conference in Luxembourg. So by that time, I hadn't really started to do a lot of research, except from when, right after I got the implant, I started to do some research on my own, trying to figure out how this device works and so on, since I couldn't get the answers I was looking for. So I Googled for my device model, and I found the technical manual of my pacemaker. And I created this network diagram based on the information I found in that manual. Actually, I didn't know when I had the implant that my heart or my body would be supplied with 2 wireless communication interfaces. I only was aware of one of them. That is the communication interface to the programmer. The programmer is a device that they have in the hospital that they use to set the configurations of the pacemaker. And of course, it's very good that this has a wireless communication channel, because that means you don't have to open up the patient in order to make adjustments to the configuration file. It's actually a long list of configuration that you need to tune to make the device work perfectly with the patient's needs. And I had my difficulties the first 3 months in getting this tuning right, and I'll come back to that. So I knew about that wireless communication interface. What really surprised me that I was not aware of was that my device has the possibility of something called home monitoring, a telemetry, where you can, if you have a device called a home monitoring unit in your home, it will establish a longer range communication channel with the device, and it will retrieve log information from the pacemaker and send them over the internet or over the telephone lines to a server abroad at the vendors. So my patient information will be stored in this server, and there's a web page, web portal where the healthcare professional can log in and see my patient information. And when I got this implant, no one informed me about this feature of my device. For me, that is not switched on right now because I don't require this close follow-up and home monitoring. But other patients have great benefits of this. Patients that have other types of diagnoses that require a more closer follow-up, they can have this by switching on the home monitoring. Also, it's cost-saving for the hospitals because you don't have to get the patients in that often for checkups. So that's why they have this communication interface. It's across several meters, while the other communication interface, you need to be really close, like centimeters away from the device. So when I discovered this as a security professional, it worried me for several reasons. One is that the attack surface is, of course, increased by having this other communication interface. Another thing that worries me is that I know that the lifetime of these devices is long. It's the same problem as you have in ICS security with all the embedded systems. So this system is embedded in my body, it's embodied, and the battery lifetime of my device is 10 years. Also, it takes a long time to get the devices out to the market because they have to satisfy very strict requirements and regulations by the FDA that are focused on safety, not on security. That means that the technology that is inside my body and that have added this wireless communication, extra wireless communication interface is most probably 15, 20 years old. It was in the start of the early 2000s that they started to add the home monitoring functionality to the devices. The pacing technology is much older. It was developed from the 60s. So in a way, I trust the pacing technology more than the wireless communication technology of my device. So as I said, I started the project 1.5 years ago because I was invited to speak at the conference. My talk was about how it was a keynote about how it is to be a security professional and live within security of depending on a piece of machine code inside of your body that you cannot inspect, that you don't know how it works, and how to live with this. And while I was preparing that talk, I thought, what should be my main message to the audience, to a room full of white hat hackers? And I decided that it should be that we need more research on medical devices. It needs more awareness. At the time, there was very little research that had been done. Actually, the past year, we have seen some more results being published, but at the time, it was only one academic group that had published research about pacemaker security. That was from University of Michigan, the group led by Dr. Kevin Fu. So that was the only research I could find when I was looking into this. So that was my main message. we need more research on medical devices and medical device security, because it's been focused on safety of the devices, and it's been focused on privacy aspects and not that much on how security aspects will then influence safety, because we cannot have safety without security. And then I thought to myself, I had just started a new job at Sintef doing research. I was a researcher at the Research Institute. I had moved from Oslo, quit my job at the CERT doing incident response. And why am I not doing this myself? So I talked to so why am I hacking my own heart? So the first episode that happened to me that sort of made me a bit worried about the security of my own device was only weeks after my implants. It was 4 or 5 weeks after I had the surgery. It was a pretty easy operation. I was back at work 2 weeks after I fell to the floor unconscious with the implant, and I could do whatever I wanted according to the doctors. So I was sent to a course in ethical hacking in London just 4 or 5 weeks after the surgery. And this was the first time I sort of stress tested my device, because I hadn't been exercising before that. So I was riding the tube together with some colleagues, and we went off at Covent Garden Station, which is an underground station, really far underground in London. And my colleagues just headed for the stairs, and I followed them, because there were long queues to the elevators. And we just started walking up the stairs. And I didn't see this sign, or I didn't read this sign. It says that it's 193 steps, equivalent to a 15-story building. And if you have heart conditions, you should use the lift. I hadn't really realized that I had a heart condition at the time. I felt fine. But I came like halfway up these stairs, and then I suddenly felt like an 80-year-old. It's like running uphill as fast as you can, or running a marathon, and you come to a stage where you just can't go on anymore. You're just exhausted all of a sudden. I didn't know what was going on, but I suspected it had to do something with my pacemaker. I never felt this before. I somehow dragged myself up the stairs. This was really tough, and I caught my breath, and then I could be normal again. But as soon as I came back to Oslo, I asked for a checkup at the hospital, and I complained, is something wrong with the pacemaker? I cannot walk upstairs, I cannot run after the bus or anything. I just suddenly feel exhausted. And it took 3 months until they figured out what was wrong. What was the problem? The problem, it turned out, was that there's a default setting in the configuration of my device that caused when I hit 160 BPM, that was the upper rate limit. My pulse was suddenly then switched down to 80 beats per minute. And that, of course, makes you not get enough oxygen, and it felt really bad. And the reason that I didn't see this was because of a software bug in the programmer, the HMI of the programmer. So the upper rate limit that was displayed on the programmer was not 160, it was a completely different number. So it was only when I did a physical test under close monitoring, and they manually calculated my upper rate limit, that they saw that this was wrong. And they could change the configurations, and after that I could exercise as usual, and actually managed to finish a half marathon running with the pacemaker. So I'm really happy about that now. But I was really affecting my physical well-being. And it was caused by a software bug, and that made me a bit worried. So in our hacking project, we have got hold of several of these home monitoring units. These are 3 different brands that we have in the lab. We're looking into the radio communication between the programmer and the devices, and actually managed to get hold of used pacemakers or implanted cardioverter defibrillators for my project. Of course, I'm not using my own implant in the research. I also need to stay a little bit away from the programmer when we're doing some of these tests. But I actually was so lucky to get some donations of used devices for my project. So we still haven't disclosed publicly what we have found in this project, because we're we're working, doing a coordinated disclosure with the vendor. But last year, I had a sort of progress in my research by accident. I actually experienced that my pacemaker failed on me while I was up in the air flying on my way to the Netherlands to give a keynote talk at hardware.io, a conference on hardware hacking. So I was sitting in the plane. Usually I don't feel that my device is pacing. I don't feel this small electrical signal at all. But suddenly I could feel it. I could feel that something was going on with my heart. I looked down at my chest, and I could see that my chest muscle was involuntarily twitching, which was really scary. So I just told the crew in the airplane, I have a pacemaker. I suspect something is wrong with the pacemaker. I had no idea what was going on. And we landed at Schiphol Airport. There was an ambulance waiting for me that took me directly to the hospital. And this is me the morning after. I had to wait in the hospital under monitoring for the night before they had a pacemaker technician. They didn't have anyone on call, so I had to wait until 8 o'clock in the morning when he came in. And this is me looking kind of happy, because this is after I got told that you don't have any hardware failure, you don't need any surgery to remove your pacemaker. It's just a software problem that we can fix. So here you can see 4 different programmers that they rolled into the hospital room, and they left me alone with these devices for a while, actually. There's a lot of USB ports that you can see on the other side of them. They're also sometimes found out in the hallway. So there's a lack of physical security surrounding these devices. And you need to have a stack of them, because all of the communication protocols are proprietary, so there's not a standard for how to communicate with my device. This means that you need to have the right programmer for the right model of the pacemaker that the patient has. So imagine someone coming into the emergency room, maybe unconscious, with an implant. Then the doctors have to try the different programmers to see which one communicates with your device. So that's something that I question. Why don't we have open standards for these communication protocols and how they implement their security? Okay, so I'm in the hospital. It turns out that it was actually a bit flip or several bit flips in the memory of my device caused by cosmic radiation that made my device malfunction. This is the face of the pacemaker technician when he saw this error message on the screen. So my device is currently running a backup program. I was somehow saved by engineering. Someone had engineered in a backup feature of my device in case this happens and it can't access its memory. There's a hard-coded program that will run your heart constantly at 70 beats per minute, and it will turn up the volume to max for the electricity so that it will capture and it will give you a heartbeat. And why was my muscle twitching? It's because there are some legacy devices still implanted in people that are using different types of wires. So usually you have this closed loop inside of the heart for the electrical current, but in the old-fashioned models, the current travels through your muscle. And since it could be that a patient has the old types of wires, they sometimes don't remove the old wires when they remove the pacemaker box. The safety function was so that it would switch to this other type of pacing. And a crash file was made on the programmer. It was created a zip file on the programmer with log files and a memory dump from my heart. And I actually got hold of this file, and it sort of increased our knowledge a bit in the hacking project. So I started out trying to get access to the code running my heart, and here you can see some of it. But as I already told you, some research has been published the last year, and trust has been broken for a lot of patients with implants because of public information about security vulnerabilities. How many of you have noticed this, let's call it the St. Jude medical scandal? Some of you have seen it before? So a group of researchers in the US, a startup company called MedSec, led by CEO Justine Bone, they did some similar research as what I'm currently doing, but they were focused on St. Jude medical devices. I don't have a St. Jude medical device implant myself, which I'm really happy about. So this is not the implants that I've been mostly looking into. They found vulnerabilities, but they decided to take a very non-traditional way of disclosing vulnerabilities. Instead of contacting the vendor or contacting the FDA, they partnered with an investment company. They shorted the stocks in St. Jude Medical, and then they released their reports about vulnerabilities in pacemakers. And of course, the stocks dropped, and they made a lot of money on the stock market. And this is how they financed their research. So it's a pretty, let's say, non-traditional way of doing vulnerability disclosures. And the manufacturer answered by suing the researchers, and this is still ongoing. So we'll see what will happen in that case. The reason they did this was because they didn't trust that the vendor would actually take action and do something about the vulnerabilities unless they could hurt them the most. And St. Jude Medical was really in a lot of trouble, and it's become worse. Because they also had, at the same time, a physical failure of the batteries in a lot of their implants. 2 patients died. 400,000 of pacemakers or implanted cardioverter defibrillators were affected by this battery failure. There were some lithium bridges that could cause the battery to run out within 24 hours. And of course, if you're dependent on the device, this can be life critical. So the patients got informed in late August, or they saw the headlines about hacking possibilities of their devices. And the advice given in the report that they had released was you should switch off the home monitoring unit, because the home monitoring unit, it's possible to do man-in-the-middle attacks against it. It's possible to give it unauthenticated firmware updates. And this can then make the home monitoring unit into a device attacking pacemakers and potentially draining their battery. So switch off the home monitoring unit was the advice given to patients from the researchers. And then we have this problem 2 months later. And the strong advice that the manufacturers gave to the patients in this case was have the home monitoring unit on at all times, because this is the only way we can detect and give you a warning about that your battery is running out in case you're affected with this. And there's 400,000 people around the world with these implants. People are still waiting to have surgeries because they need to have surgery to remove their device to just get this ticking bomb out of their body. So imagine the anxiety with patients when this came up. So this didn't get sort of acknowledged and communicated by the FDA and the vendor until January this year. They issued some software patches, and so first they responded with saying, no, we don't have any security vulnerabilities in the products. And then they came back in January and said, yes, we have security vulnerabilities, and we made some software patches. But they haven't patched all the problems, including one big backdoor into the devices. It turned out that they had implemented authentication with the RSA algorithm with a 24-bit key length, which is kind of ridiculous. So this backdoor into implants is still not fixed, as far as I know. And then the cybersecurity patches came in January 9, and it turned out that the FDA wasn't happy with the way the vendor had managed both the cybersecurity problems and the battery draining problem. So they issued a warning letter. And this, I think, is the nightmare of any manufacturers, to get that kind of warning letter. It's really harsh warning letter saying they have to do something because they knew about these issues and hadn't fixed them. So we'll see what happens. There's a problem for a lot of people out there with implanted devices that can be hacked, and some also that have this potential battery failure. And we also seen another case. This is from 2011, where another manufacturers actually had to pay a huge fine because they had neglected reports about patient safety issues due to faulty implants. So you cannot trust the technology. We have to create a better future for people like myself and others that are dependent on medical devices inside of their body, making them stay alive. So I don't want to start on end on this really depressive note. I want to end on a happy note, because for me, of course, having the device, the benefits outweighs the risks. Without the device, I would probably not stay alive. I would not be here on stage giving this talk to you. I would not be able to run a half marathon with my device, as you can see in this picture. Look really happy. This is me just before the finishing line. So for me, I'm really grateful that this technology exists. I just want to make it better and more secure for the future. So thank you. And also I want to mention that I'm not doing this alone. I have a lot of people that are helping me along, both in the I Am the Calorie group and people that have contributed to my research. So I want to say thank you to all these people too.
Great. So we have time for a few questions. I just ask, when you ask a question, just introduce yourself and do the short version, your name, and I'm Dale Peterson from Digital Bond, and then ask your question.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jay Abdullah. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Services for Schneider Electric. Excellent presentation, fantastic. I've never seen a presentation with such a critical and personally emotional type of subject, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I actually have two very brief questions, please. It seems to me there's so much to learn. I mean, from a security perspective, we see so many vulnerabilities, we see so many backdoors. We're talking about software glitches, battery situations, even the regulating body themselves, the FDA in this particular case. I don't see them moving fast enough. The fact that they issued a warning and then they sent a letter, and to this day they still don't have a specific solution, that's a major concern to me. So I just have two questions. The first one, you mentioned in the Hippocratic Oath that you've got cybersecurity updates. For these types of devices, the first question is, are these types of updates required to only happen inside of a hospital under the care of medical professionals?
Yeah, so the way it works today is that, so I asked about this because I couldn't find the information. I had to ask my pacemaker technicians and doctor how they do this. And they say that a person from the manufacturer comes to the hospital with a USB stick and updates the programmer once in a while. And then when the patient then gets hooked up to the programmer, a software update may be transmitted. It's not like when you're updating your laptop and you sort of click agree and you sign or you say you sign this end user's license agreement, and so who's liable in case something goes wrong? It's all unknown. This is something we need to tackle and have more transparency around. So I would personally feel better to have a patch, a security update to my device when I'm in the hospital, because in case something goes wrong, you will have some medical professionals that can take care of you. At least for me, that's 100% dependent on the device. I wouldn't like to have remote over-the-air updates coming in through the hotel Wi-Fi while I'm sleeping in my hotel room. That wouldn't feel as safe.
Yeah, thank you very much. The second question is really more generic. Where do we begin? I mean, I see there's so many problems in this subject. You've got non-standard protocols. You've got the utilization of multiple machines to get yourself a firmware update, backdoors, battery problem. Where do we start in order to regulate this type of subject, and standardize the security solutions from a development perspective?
Yeah, we have to start actually creating requirements and start asking about or demanding security in these projects. I think there's things to do. Of course, the regulators can do things, but also we as customers can do a lot by just beginning to ask questions about it. What's kind of funny or strange in this case is that the vendors doesn't see patients as their customers. It's the hospitals, it's the one that's actually purchasing the equipment that's their customers. So when they make these devices, they don't really look into what the patient wants. And there are patients out there that are fighting for more transparency to get hold of their data because they cannot get access to it. These home monitoring units work by, they are black boxes to the patients. You don't see what's going on, you don't get any feedback in case something bad is detected. It all goes to the healthcare provider. Of course, there are different, patients are different, and some want to know everything, like myself, and some just don't want to care about this technology, and they don't feel a need to know everything. But I think that we need to have more transparency, more openness, and more open standards for how this works, so that people like me that want to know can get satisfied.
Marie, you mentioned the St. Jude situation, and I actually had an opportunity to interview Justine on stage at S4. The one thing that stuck out to me is she claimed, and I'm a little suspect of this claim, but she claimed that the device that they disclosed the information on was dramatically less secure than the competitors' devices. That she said they had these in her lab and she tested it. I'm not asking you about whether that's true or not. My question is, do you see the hospitals and the doctors who you mentioned are the customer, do you see them actually looking at this information and saying, well, we've seen the reports and we're not going to put any more of these St. Jude devices, even your doctors that must be aware that you're doing this research?
No, they are not really focused on that. They are focused on what will deliver the best therapy to the patient. And of course, that's what they're supposed to worry about. They're not trained or supposed to worry about security bugs or security vulnerabilities in the devices. So that's not on their radar, really. I talked to lots of doctors, and they always seem to be very surprised about this fact. They don't really think about the medical devices in this way. I don't know about this claim about the models they were looking at were significantly worse than the others. Related to this, I can mention that just last week a report was published by Bilarius and others at Whitescope, and they had looked at the programmers from 4 different vendors, and their conclusion was that they were all bad. They all had lots of problems when it comes to security. I think in general, the whole healthcare sector struggles in this regard.